Today's our last shir of the series of 4 shirim about milchama, about war. And as I really tried. I said I would try to only talk about topics I have not talked about in the past. And as I hope you noticed, it's really not only a very large topic, and there are a lot of things going on here. It's also unfortunately, it's a very practical, very relevant topic that every time we give a shir about it, people, I can see their brains are like thinking about the news and things that are happening around us. So before we actually go back to the main shir today, which is about taking spoils, Chad Shalal, I would like to dedicate a few minutes to continuing a little bit from last week, but in a little bit of a different way. Last week, if you remember, we focused on fighting on Shabbat, and whether or not fighting on Shabbat is part of the classic pikuach nefesh idea that we have in all Hilchot Shabbat, that whether someone's life is in danger, then that overrides Shabbat, like if someone is sick. So the same would go for a war, the same would be for a war, and therefore one would be able to fight on Shabbat because of pikuach nefesh. However, we said that Rav Goren and probably others really felt that there's a special source, an alternative source that allows us to fight on Shabbat, Adri Dita, the day of the siege, permitting us to fight on Shabbat. And we explained that according to Rav Goren, it's more of a hutra than a tchuya, heter, and would perhaps allow us to do much, much more. For example, this I did speak in the past, let's say collecting bodies from a field on Shabbat would be permitted more under the hutra of Rav Goren because its impact on the morale, and that is something we should take also into consideration when we are fighting on Shabbat. So that was last week. Why am I mentioning this again? Because this week was 50 years for the Entebbe operation. I know that some people think about it as 4th of July, but it's actually the Jewish date was Motzei Shabbat, Sunday, and I'll just tell you something very. This past Shabbat, we made the kiddush. We became grandparents last week, and we made the kiddush right away for my new granddaughter, and because I was a bit late, because she was born right before, a few days before Shabbat, someone was already making the kiddush. And we shared the kiddush. I didn't know why they were making kiddush. And in Alon Shvut, when you make a kiddush, it gives you the permission to speak 5 minutes about your kiddush. So the people before me, when they spoke, they said no one knew why they were making the kiddush. She said, so the lady got up and she said, tonight, this was Shabbat, right? Tonight, Motzei Shabbat, is 50 years for Entebbe operation. I'm making kiddush because both my parents were on the plane. And they were kidnapped and they were hijacked. They were there and the whole thing. And they never really made a big thing out of it. And I want to make a kiddush in their honor that they were saved 50 years ago tonight. So wow, that really brought it to home. And I realized that we're talking about in our shir about the Dinei Milchama. So let's talk a little bit, just for a few minutes, about the Entebbe operation b'halacha. Now, what does that mean b'halacha? So interestingly enough, in my book I wrote about this, but Rav Avad Yosef, at the time chief rabbi of Israel, wrote a very long article about Mivtza Entebbe b'halacha. So when he discussed the question, the issue of the Entebbe operation, so the truth is most of what he spoke about is not so new to us nowadays, right? The question of if you have a captive in a house, and let's say they're willing to surrender, but you have to let 100 terrorists out of jail. They're willing to exchange the captives for terrorists, or the alternative is to go in and to endanger soldiers and the captives. But that's a question that I would say Entebbe really brought up but since then many have talked about this question, including myself in one of the shirim here. That is not a new thing. But what is interesting though is Linyanenu is, first of all, he does mention that the Entebbe operation happened on Shabbat. It really happened on Motzei Shabbat, but they left on Shabbat afternoon, and the story is that they left without getting permission. They left the country before the government gave them the green light, and the reason was because they said if we don't leave now, we're going to miss the window of opportunity. You can always take us back when we're in the air, but we have to leave now. So that was like an interesting Shabbat question, right? We're flying on Shabbat. even though we're not 100% going. Now, I know that everyone in this room doesn't even think that's a question, and I agree, right? That obviously, in the bigger picture of Pikuach Nefesh, obviously that'll be permitted, but Rav Aviad does mention this and talk a little bit about the idea of Mechemet Mitzvah is not just a war against an enemy that's attacking us, but even an operation to save Jews in another country would be considered Mechemet Mitzvah, which I find an interesting point, and obviously be permitted to do on Shabbat. And again, I'm not going to the whole discussion, but I just thought it would be it's just interesting to bring that up. I tell this because it was 50 years, as I said, Motzei Shabbat, Mamash to Motzei Shabbat. It was Mamash Motzei Shabbat, the operation. I'm sure you remember, right? You remember it?
Do we all remember exactly where we were when we heard the news? I do.
Right, I'm sure, right, exactly right. And so I think I told you once before that I once heard a lecture of a Chayal, a speech of a Chayal that was there, and he told us that it was that he made Havdalah on the Uganda Air Force burning. He made the Borei Moresh on the airplanes that were burning. That's what he said. So that's why I always remember that it was Motzei Shabbat. So it's quite easy to remember that. But what the issue that I do want to mention quickly, and Rabbi Bleichin is I'm sure some of you are familiar with this book of Rabbi Bleich from New York, who puts out these summaries of all halachic questions that are about technology and medicine, and a little bit like a tchumen, but in English. And in volume 2 of this book, Halachic Problems, Rabbi Bleich discusses the Entebbe operation too, but from a different perspective. He discusses whether or not this is considered a natural miracle or an unnatural miracle. What do I mean by that? Like, why is that a question? So here's something just interesting. It's just fascinating, and I think it's just important to mention this. He writes about it, and you can read it inside his book, but I also wrote about it in my book. But apparently, in the 70s, this was a hot topic in the Haredi world. When I say Haredi, I mean in America. Apparently, the Satmar Hasidim at the time which I think controlled one of the Aguda or whatever, they came out and said that this is a terrible thing that the Israeli army did, and what are they trying to always provoke? To provoke the Goyim and put the lives of these Jews in danger, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe came out very much against the Satmar Rebbe at the time, and against this publication at the time in the papers. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe came out, and you can find in a few places that he gave speeches and talks that the Lubavitcher Rebbe said this is a miracle. This is an amazing miracle, and more so, who are we to question God's miracles that are done by people who are not religious? Meaning that was part of the tension that was then. How can it be? We can't accept that it's a miracle because it was done by people who are not from. Right? That was part of the issue at the time. And
somebody in the group was from. You made Havdalah?
Okay, I don't think they're that rational anyway, but he was wearing a Israeli uniform. How can he be from? I don't understand your question. I don't understand what you're saying. Anyway, so he wasn't wearing, was he wearing a gartel when he made Havdalah? There you go. So,
he had a belt on,
it's not a real gartel though. Anyway, what I'm saying is that if you look in Igros Moshe, there's a tshuva of Moshe, which is a very strange tshuva. Rav Moshe has a tshuva in which he says that the miracle of Entebbe is a nes galui. And who are we to question God's miracles? That's a tshuva of Rav Moshe, which is very strange, peculiar, because Rav Moshe it doesn't usually just write his thoughts and feelings. It's a book of law. He rules. He gives psak. What exactly is the psak that the Entebbe operation is nes galui? So the answer is that the Lubavitcher Rebbe apparently asked certain rabbis at the time to make it very clear to the communities that this is a nes galui, that this is a real nes, and that we recognize it, that it's a miracle, and we should thank God and recognize it as such. And Rav Zevin at the time, who was a Lubavitcher Chassid, who was a youth Talmid Chacham, was asked by Lubavitcher Rebbe to put out a psak by the Beis Din of Chabad. What would happen if one of the survivors would go back to Entebbe, something that, by the way, happens happened this week, happened a few years ago. Would they make a bracha? She'asali neis b'makom hazeh. The Gemara says that if you go back to a place where you had a miracle that happened to you, you recite the bracha, and even the grandchildren, by the way, of this person should say this bracha. Now, I don't think that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was so worried and concerned about the bracha, but it was a principle, right? This was a great opportunity to highlight the great miracle. So Rab Leich writes about this in his book the following way. The question is, do you make a bracha on any miracle that happens to you? What is a miracle? If a person was in a car accident and he was saved, so when you go back to the same place of your accident, you make a bracha every time you pass by. So there's a machloket in the Rishonim. What kind of miracle does this halacha apply to? Some say it's a natural if even a natural miracle. That's it has to be quite amazing, but a natural miracle is also included in this bracha.
What's the difference? A miracle is a miracle. What do you mean natural versus unnatural?
If a woman gives birth, is that a miracle? So a woman should say every time. So a woman should go every time she go back to the hospital. She should say that was the Gra. The Gra used that example. The Gra said, if we start talking about natural miracles, so does the woman have to say a bracha every time she goes back to the hospital that she gave birth? And so if you say no, it has to be a bit more complicated. So what's complicated? What has to happen? Is a cesarean? Like how far do you go? So some Rishonim say no, it has to be unnatural. Only an unnatural. And the Gemara actually brings examples of Kriyat Yamsuf. The Gemara says Kriyat Yamsuf. You're 100% right with your question, because that is the question. The question is, what is a miracle? That's what I'm saying. What is the definition of a miracle? And it's a great opportunity to talk about what is a miracle by the halachic definition of a miracle for this purpose. And the Shulchan Aruch brings both opinions. The Shulchan Aruch brings both opinions, and the psak of Shulchan Aruch is we only make this bracha if it was an unnatural miracle. However, and this is what's interesting and fascinating. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Baal HaTanya, disagrees. He's one of the only Achron that disagrees with the psak of Shulchan Aruch. And the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch Harav, in his famous work of Shulchan Aruch, the Baal HaTanya paskins that even for an unnatural miracle, you make a bracha. So it just comes to some, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was the one who started this, and quoting so it's quite amazing to me that Rabbi Bleich says, the psak is you don't make a bracha, but if you're a Chabadnik and you follow Lubavitcher Rebbe, but the truth is, I don't think it's so simple. I think this is, I want to give this share about Shalal today, but I do think that this halachic question is a fascinating one, not because of a practical, I don't think it's such a big nafkamina, whether or not make a bracha or not in this specific case, but it is a fascinating example of how people look at what happens around them, and how do you define the situation in front of you as a miracle or not? What makes a miracle a miracle? How far do you go? So I actually looked, because I was interested to see what Rav Melamed says about this in Pnei Halacha, because he's a very practical guy, and I wanted to know what he thinks about this machloket. And he almost gave a third definition of a nes, meaning you're right. There are Kirat Yamsuf, that is an unnatural nes, and then there's childbirth, which is natural. But in the middle, there's a lot of gray area of how we see things. Was what happened in Iran, was that a miracle? Was Entebbe a miracle? 6-Day War was a miracle. So I'm saying it's somewhere in the middle here, and I think that I think this question is not just a small technical question, but it really is a major question in hashkafa, where we put ourselves today in the religious society. I think that this is one of the machlokets that we have with our Haredi brothers about how we see the world around us, and how we read between the lines, and how we see the events that are taking place around us, including these wars. How we see them from the hashgacha perspective, from a miraculous perspective. So therefore, I think that the Entebbe operation question was not just about Entebbe, but I think it really continues till nowadays should serve as a great example of a machloket and discussion. What makes a miracle a miracle? So I just wanted to mention that the 50 years for the Tabory operation, and like I said, I'm not trying to push it, but in my book I have 2 chapters about this in my book, and Rab Leich has a whole chapter about this. It's an interesting discussion.
Did you bring your book here to sell us?
No. There's a copy here. You can always borrow it from
We're
here.
going to at one point.
Well, hopefully my new book is coming out mamash any day, so then I'll bring hopefully 2 copies. Okay. Sorry. Of the new book is I have to remember because it's been a long time. I gave it into Magid like a long time ago. It's 1,000 years of halacha. That's what it's called. 1,000 years of halacha. Yeah.
10,000 pages?
It's in English. No. It's in English. No. As I said last week, our last topic in the series will be about taking shalal spoils. Now, the truth is, this year from a military, realistic, nowadays perspective, is a very simple one. The Israeli army forbids taking any form of shalal, no one's allowed to touch anything. If you remember, there were stories in Gaza where guys found sacks of money and they were told to burn it. You heard about this? Some were taken, and there were cases where the guys mamash torched money. They were told you can't enjoy it, you can't have any benefit from it. They were told to burn everything. Sorry?
Burning money is a terrible sin.
Why about tashchit?
They should bring it
You're bringing up some interesting questions. I'm just telling you the law of the Israeli army forbids taking any souvenirs, as you would say.
We also found our stuff there, though. We found.
Okay, so right. So I'm talking about taking a picture off the wall when you walk into someone's house. So the army. I'm not saying right or wrong right now. I'm just telling you what the army's laws are. The army's laws are very, very simple. And the truth is that the Israeli army, no one owes anything. No one owns anything. No chayal can own something that he captures. It's not a personal achievement that he now walks into a house and it becomes his. It's really he's a representative of the Israeli army, a representative of the Jewish people, of the Israeli government, whatever you want to say. So that's quite simple. I'm not saying what happens on the ground. I'm just saying to you what the law is. What I'm interested in. Okay, I'm not going to do fatwa right now. That's really a different topic. What I do want to talk about is what does the Torah have to say about this matter? What is in our sources? What is the discussion about taking spoils of war? What's the halachic or the Torah perspective of taking shalal b'milchama? So this is one of the most fascinating the examples of. We don't have many sources for this. Rabbis the past 2,000 years didn't have many shilas about this. They weren't asked by poskim weren't asked. I just came back from war. What do I do? This really wasn't so much of a question, and therefore our main source is going to be the Tanakh. Our main source is going to be reading between the lines of the Tanakh stories and seeing what was the reality in the days of the Tanakh regarding shalal. Was it permitted or not? Now I know that you're all thinking now of all the different wars. So let's make a little bit of a seder in them, and let's argue the following, if it's okay with you. Let's argue is that the default seems to be that it is pashut, it's simple, that when you go to war and you conquer the enemy, the spoils go to the conqueror, right? To the victor. What isn't there such a right? Mitsuyan. So by the way, but I can just throw at you cases where that's not true. That's what I just said. I know you're all thinking about different wars, but like I said, let's argue that the default is really that you're allowed to take the spoils of war. I'll give you a few examples. We just mentioned in this. It's coming up mamash next week parsha in Matot Masei. We're going to read about Mechemet Midyan as a mamash parshat Shavua. This week is parshat Balak, and as a result of parshat Balak, the Jews go out to war against the Midianites, which is, by the way, a war that also is a very strange war. It stands by itself. The laws of siege, some of them are learned from Midian, and I discussed it briefly. If we can learn from Mechemet Midian to other cases, we learn about Tovalin Kalim, about Hechsher Kalim from the War of Midian, which is of course taking the spoils. Meaning, how do we know that today, nowadays, that when you have a pot that you buy from China, how do you know that you have to kasher in the mikveh? Now, to put in the mikveh, what's the source? The source is Mechemet Midyan. That is the source. And we pass on that it's a deoraita source. Taking your pots and pans into a mikveh, Tevilat Kelim, according to most poskim, is a chiyuv deoraita. We learn it from Mechemet Midyan. What's Mechemet Midyan? They took the spoils of war. They took the pots and pans of the Midianites. They brought them back to the Machaneh. And besides being traits, they had to kasher them with the fire, Hagala, Libun. But besides that, they also had to take them to mikveh. And that is a biblical halacha that we learn from the spoils of war, Midian. Now, by the way, I'll just say it right now. In the 48 war, there was an interesting question when Chayalim were taking, they took spoils of war in the 48 war, meaning they took, let's say, kelim, that they dishes, and they wanted to use them. The question was, did they have to tovel them in a mikveh or not? Why? Because part of the question was, who owned this? Did the Israeli army own it, or is it Hefker? And so part of the questions that at the time Rav Frank, the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, has a tshuva, or Rav Meltzer, I think Rav Meltzer. Rabbi Zalman Meltzer has a tshuva about this, about the 48 war. He was asked about whether or not the Chayalim that found vessels that they wanted to cook with, do they have to total them or not? Do they own them? Are they now, by capturing a house, is there a kinyan done, and therefore you own now the vessel, and therefore you would have to kasher it? Or do you say that still it's like a borrowing from a goy, because at the time the Israeli government did not decide yet what they're doing with what are they giving back certain villages? Where would the line be? So is it more like borrowing? As you know, if you borrow from a guy, you don't have to tovel it. So is it really ours or is it not ours? So these are part of the question. But like I said, the source, it all goes back to Mechemet Midyan, where the default was, as you can see in the second source on your sheet, וישבו בני ישראל את נשי מדיין ואת אפם ואת כל בהמתם ואת כל מקניהם ואת כל חילם בזזו ואת כל עריהם במשובתם שרפו באש ויקחו, פסוק י"א, ויקחו את כל השלל ואת כל המקוח באדם ובבהמה, and they bring it back to the Machaneh. And there we see in pasuk of Zayin, the Kadosh Baruch Hu teaches us, וחצית את המלכוח בין תופסי המלחמה היוצאים לצבא ובין כל העדה. You have to take all the shalal, all the spoils, and divide them not only by to the soldiers that went to war, but the whole Eidah, the whole Machaneh. The spoils of war are not just for the soldiers, but you have to give them out to the entire nation of Israel. So Imamish, it's very clear that we learn a lot about shalal from this war, but it's obvious that was the conduct, what people did. And it even says, pasuk of Chet, some of it you have to give it to God. Some of it has to go to God. Pasuk of Tet, machatzit yikachu b'netzav elazar kohen trumat Hashem. And basically he has to go around. The shalal, the spoils, are not just to the soldiers, but they go to the Mishkan, they go to the Kohanim, they go to the people. You must spread it around, and everyone must enjoy the shalal. We also see later on in Sefer Devarim. In Sefer Devarim, you don't have this in front of you, which is fine. But in Sefer Devarim, we have the war of, as someone just mentioned, the war of Sichon and Og. In Devarim Perek Gimel, we have, after we captured Sichon ve'og, it says, "V'nachrem otam kasher asinu Sichon, v'chol ha'beima u'shlal ha'arim bazonu lanu." Again, with Sichon and Og, Melech HaBashan, those are the wars in Sefer Devarim. As we made our way into Israel, the Torah says explicitly that we took all the spoils of war, and I think that is the default of the wars at the time, and also the Torah's kind of answer to our question that it is permitted. I'll just end by saying that it's not just It's not just those wars, but in Sefer Dvarim Perek Kaf, when it comes to the Shivat Amamin, the 7 nations, again, we say God tells us that if we call for peace and they don't, and they refuse peace, then we go, we battle, and we take v'achalta. Sorry, רק אנשים ועטף ובהמה וחושר בעיר כל שללה תבוז לך. Shlala tavos. You take the shalal. You take all the spoils. V'achalta et shlal oivecha. It almost seems that it's a mitzvah. The Ramban, by the way, suggests it's almost like a mitzvah to take the spoils of the war. And this goes back to what we spoke about 2 weeks ago, that perhaps when we enter Eretz Yisrael and we're allowed to eat even treifus, we're allowed to eat chazer, we said, this goes back, when I mentioned there 2 weeks ago, I mentioned this idea that it has to do with the spoils of war, which seems to be the default. However, many of us seem to remember other stories in Tanakh where it's not so simple, where the Torah or the Navi tells us explicitly not to touch the spoils of war. So what's the default? The stories of Sichon, Og, Midian, or the stories that we are told not to? So let's go through the stories that we are told not to touch the spoils. Does anyone remember where we're told not to touch the spoils? Okay, so Yafeh. Okay, so let's start with Yericho. Good. Let's go by the order. So I'm saying let's start with Yericho first. Okay, Yericho, beginning of Sefer Yehoshua, we know that the first city that we ever conquered was Yericho in Eretz Yisrael, and as part of this victory, Yehoshua decides to make a cherem. It seems to be his idea that no one is allowed to build the city. The city has to be built. Vayta ir cherem. We're talking about Yehoshua Perek Vav, Pasuk Tetzayin. The entire city has to become cherem. And not only that, as I said, no one can build Yericho. By the way, which is, you should know, it's not my topic, but you should know it's a great halachic question. Are we allowed to build Yericho nowadays? Is this cherem? Yes, but let's say we'd be able to build Yericho today. Would the Isur still be there? Or some people say that to build the town called Yericho might be problematic. Not just the place, but to use the name. When they build Mitzpeh Yericho, this was discussed, by the way. This was a question that came up. Why is Yehoshua making this cherem? What's the idea? If we just learned that taking the spoils of war is what the Torah permits and allows, and maybe even like a positive thing, why does Yehoshua do exactly the opposite? By the way, and let's not forget, it wasn't just a small matter. We know what happened, that Achan took the cherem. And as a result, Am Yisrael lost in the first battle against the Ai. So it wasn't a small thing that Yehoshua's decree not to touch the cherem. It was a big thing. Why does he make this cherem? Why does he not allow people to take the spoils of war? This is not my main topic, but I will mention that Mefarshim discuss this and really suggest many different possibilities. One of them is, and this goes back to the issue that we gave also last week. If you recall, last week I discussed that the Kibush Yericho was done according to Chazal on Shabbat. And we said that perhaps the source of fighting on Shabbat is learned from the War of Yericho. Some people say that it's because it was done on Shabbat, it was like Maaseh Shabbos, it was like something that you can't touch because there was Chilul Shabbos involved as if. Okay? Ad Kedei Kach. That's one way of looking at it. Some people suggest that it was like a truma, right? When the first fruit of bikurim, truma, the idea of the first we dedicate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we put aside. Yericho was the first city that was conquered in Eretz Yisrael, so therefore it was like some kind of dedication to God and not to man. To say we dedicate it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and not to and not to man. Perhaps there's a deeper idea here, which I think should already be mentioned right now. Perhaps what we are seeing here is that There might be an ethical issue. There may be perhaps a problem with taking spoils that maybe Yeshua is already aware of, and he's making a statement in the beginning of the war of Eretz Yisrael. In other words, perhaps it could be that the default is, you capture a city, you take the spoils. I mean, someone just mentioned before, some of you mentioned before, it's like Baltashchit maybe the city is destroyed, so enjoy the spoils of the war. What's this idea? However, Yeshua is teaching us perhaps a lesson, which is that there's always a danger in taking the spoils of war as well, and that could be for different reasons. One could perhaps be taking us back to Sefer Devarim, Parshat Re'eh, to Ir Nidachat. If you look at Ir Nidachat, the Torah tells us that if you come to a city that all the worship that is worshiping Avodah Zarah, then the Torah tells us to destroy the entire city, and there it says you have to burn all the spoils of the war of the city. You can't take anything. Some people say that perhaps that's what brought Yeshua also to do the same for Yericho. But what's the idea? It's interesting because the Torah told us in Sefer Devarim that when it comes to 7 nations, you take everything, and suddenly in Dachat you're supposed to destroy everything. The answer perhaps is that a city that worships Avodah Zarah, then by taking the spoils of war, you are taking into your house to'eva. You're taking things that were Avodah Zarah. I mean, you come back with, I don't know, if you make a war against the Buddhas and you take all the little Buddha statues into your house, you're bringing Avodah Zarah into your house. And Ir Nidachat is a symbol of a city that is, why was it destroyed? It was destroyed because it's an evil city of Avodah Zarah. By the way, it was never just Avodah Zarah. It went together with Gilui Arayot. That's in the Torah, very, very simple. That was a combination of Gilui Arayot, Avodah Zarah. It's Las Vegas. I don't know. It's a city of To'eva, it's a Sdom, and therefore v'lo yidbak biyadcha me'uma min acherem. You don't want anything to do with the evil city. So perhaps that's one problem that we have with taking spoils. Perhaps that's one way of looking at it. But I think there's a deeper way of looking at this, and that's what I really want to highlight today. And this takes us to Mechemet Amalek, specifically, not Mechemet Amalek so much, but more to Megillat Esther. If you look at the next page, in Megillat Esther, I brought the pasuk from Esther. It's very clear that when we destroyed Aser b'nei Haman and our enemies, Ubabiza lo shalchu et yadam. That Megillah emphasizes that we did not take the spoils of the war in Megillat Esther. And I brought here a perush that's brought down in the Dat Mikra. It's right there on the top shelf. That when I was a kid growing up, that was the only book that we had. Really, that was written a commentary on the Tanakh. And he says like this: Afapi shemordechai tziva'u shalam navoz. It says exactly the opposite. You're allowed. We should take the spoils. Nimneu hayudim milakachat. The Jews did not take it. La'arot shemilchamtam eina lavuzbaz elarak la'atzil et nafsham miyad oivehem. That there's a statement here that the Jews want to make it very clear. They didn't start this war. They don't have any agendas in this war. They have no interest in this war for gaining any kind of money or gains. They are just doing it to save their lives. Because when you take the spoils of war, there's always that worry that you have an interest, you have an agendas, and that it's not tahor. Your agenda is not real. It's not, and taking the spoils of war can a lot of times taint the point of which you came from when you went to battle, when you went to war, when you declared war. And the Jews wanted to make it very clear that they only did it because their lives were in danger. And I think that this idea perhaps could be shared in the case of Yeshua, and we could argue that perhaps Yeshua wanted to make a very clear statement in the beginning of the first war, the first battle in Israel. He wanted to say, the default is you can take spoils of war. You're right. But I want on the first battle that we make in Israel, I want to make it very, very clear that we are doing this to capture the land of Israel. We are doing it it's a land that God gave us, and that we are not here. We're not Vikings who are coming on a boat to another country just to get rich, to take the spoils of war. We have our moral right to be here. We have a God promise here. Meaning, like I said, taking spoils can many times taint the real agenda of going to war. And I want to show you one more example before I go into the next topic to do with this. I want to go into I think I mentioned this once before in Shir here, but I think it's important to mention again in this context. After Sabra v'Shatila, after the massacre of Sabra v'Shatila in 1982, where, don't forget, it was Christians who killed Muslims in the refugee camp of Sabra v'Shatila, and at the time the committee that Israel made called, anyone remember? No, that was the Yom Kippur War. Vadat Kahan, right? Vadat Kahan was, after a lot of pressure. Remember, even Rav Soloveitchik at the time, he was already quite sick and old, made a telephone call to Begin and told him to make sure that they make a committee. The committee found that no Israeli soldier was involved in any way in this massacre, but they did say that Ariel Sharon, being the Minister of Defense, had a certain responsibility just because he was the Minister of Defense, and their main suggestion was that he should resign. So he resigned and became later on Prime Minister. Anyway, in that case, at the time, Rav Lichtenstein wrote a letter that was published in Hatzofeh. All 5 people that read it at that time, that paper, and I think it's a very important letter that he wrote, and was published later on in different places, translated. Rav Lichtenstein gave a short shir about the Milchemet Amalek and the days of Shaul. If we wanted ever to give a series of shiurim just on Amalek, that would be enough to fill a few shiurim about where Amalek comes in Tanakh and how we meet Amalek and where is Amalek in Tanakh. Every time it's a different story and there's a lot of things going on there. But when Shaul is told to destroy the people of Amalek, we all know that he doesn't do exactly what God told him. God tells him the Navi tells him, Shmuel tells him, go and destroy all the animals and don't leave anyone alive. And what does Shaul do? He brings back the king alive and he brings the cattle back alive. Shmuel meets him and says to him, because you do not do God's will, you are fired. And it's quite amazing because Shaul doesn't understand why he's fired. Because according to him, he did exactly what God told him to do. Because in his eyes, what, so I left some sheep alive? What's so terrible?
You left the king alive.
I left one king alive. What's so terrible? What's so terrible? What's so terrible? So we'll kill him now. What is so bad? Why is it such a terrible sin? I mean, I always like to compare this to David HaMelech. David HaMelech slept with a married woman and killed her husband. And David Melech Chai V'Kayam, and Shaul loses because he was merciful on cattle, right? How does that make any sense? So obviously there's a good answer to this. I think the best answer is David HaMelech does tshuva, Shaul doesn't. But that's not my topic right now. But l'gufo shel inyan, what is so terrible? So Rav Lichtenstein explained the following, and I think it's a very profound idea. Rav Lichtenstein said, because Shaul goes to battle for only one reason, because God told him to. But if Shaul deviates from God's ruling, from God's details, then what he's doing is he's saying, I have my own agendas. I have my political agendas. I'm going to war because of oil, because of gas, because of interest, because of the stock market, because of my kavod, because of my politics. By changing even by a bit from God's law and God's order, you are you are turning this battle, this war, into a personal war, not a religious war. That the only justification from our perspective is Kadosh Baruch Hu commanded you, and that is the greatest sin of all. Because by doing that, you are turning the Jewish people into murderers. Because there's no justification to go to war for political gain of a person that has agendas. What turns a war into a just war? That's a good question. What is a just war? From our perspective as religious Jews, is that Kadosh Baruch Hu commands us to go to war. We believe in the what was the word I'm looking for? In the morality, the ethical justification for doing such a thing, because Kadosh Baruch Hu commanded us. But if it's political, then we are turning our chayalim into murderers. And Rav Lichtenstein hints, and it's a very strong hint in his article. He says we have to have total transparency that the government of Israel is sending our boys to battle, to war, in a way that we can trust our government, that there is no agendas, there's no political issues, that we're doing it just because we want to save Am Yisrael, and we want to make sure that our people are safe and sound, and chas v'shalom, that we should find out that there is political reasons for people going to war. Yes?
Did anyone ever suggest that the fact that the Jews did not take the plunder during the time of Esther was the tikkun of the descendants of Saul, meaning Mordecai and Esther?
I think so. Yeah. It's all connected. People talk about the connection. Like I said, like I said, the whole Agag. The pshat is that Haman wasn't Amalek, right? You know that. I mean, there's no reason to say that. There's no. If you read the Tanakh, there's no indication, because it says Agag. The word Agagi doesn't. It's a name. I mean, there was if your name is Moshe and last name Moshe, they're your relatives. I mean, Chazal make the connection, and since we were kids, we always were taught that Haman is a descendant of Amalek. But the pshat of the Tanakh is that he wasn't. I mean, there's no. So you could talk about he was Amalek in the sense that he wanted to kill the Jewish people. But like I said, this is way out of our. I don't want to go there right now. But you're right to connect the things together. You're 100% right. But like I said, going back to what I just said before, I think that. If I suggested before that perhaps Yehoshua either dedicated, one suggestion is we say he dedicated Yericho to God, like Truma, like Bikurim, as a statement, as if Lo b'chayev lo b'koach, kim biruchi amar Hashem, to show that it's really God who's fighting for us, kochi v'otzim yadi, to make that statement that God's fighting for us. That's one suggestion. The other suggestion we said is that perhaps taking the spoils taints you, because it means that you're taking the avodah zarah, you're taking all the negative things that are associated with the culture of the people that were there before you into your homes. That's the second possibility. And the third possibility, what we just said now, is perhaps because of tainting, as I said, the pure agenda for the justification of fighting a just war. And those are the three reasons that we gave, that maybe to suggest why Yehoshua did what he did. And like I said, we used the story of Esther a little bit to really back that up. At this point, though, towards the end of this year, I would like to focus, I don't have much time, but I'd like to focus on a detail of the Shalal, which I think is very, very important. In Sefer Dvar, on your source sheet that I gave you, you'll see that on the bottom of the page it says, in Shmuel Aleph, Perek Lamed, we have the war of David again against Amalek in Siklag. If you remember the story, just briefly, David HaMelech comes back. David HaMelech has a camp in Siklag. He goes roaming like Robin Hood and the Merry Men. They go out to roaming the countryside. And when he comes back to Siklag, he sees fire coming up from his machaneh. The Amaleki raided his camp, took the women and children, and took them in captivity. And David HaMelech swears that he will take them, that he will free them, and he goes to war to the Amaleki, and he kills them, and then they bring back the spoils of war. And what do they do with them? So in Shmuel Aleph it says, Ki כחלק היורד במלחמה וכחלק היושב על הכלים יחדיו יחלוקו. David HaMelech decides that if you look in the Psukim, you'll see that as they went to war, they kept half of the guys behind, and the rest went into the battle. I just mentioned in Tabory operation, I told you this guy named Havdalah. So he told us when he spoke to us that his job was they brought a lot of them. Most of the Chayalim in the Tabory operation were just there to guard the planes on the terminal. They had 4 planes, and they were afraid that there would be the terrorists, not terrorists, but Ugandanian, I don't know what you say, soldiers would attack them. I mean, they would be in the terminal, and the planes would be by themselves, and who knows what would happen. So they went apparently to Badechat, to a course of Ksinim, and they took the guys that were in the course of becoming officers, and they took them to be just Shomrim, just to guard. And he told us that there were guys there were people that were generals, heard about it, they said, please, can we go? Like they took like mamash generals to just do shmirah on the tarmac. So David HaMelech had a similar story. Not everyone goes into battle. We have people, as we say in Israel, in Ba'oref, in Tumchei Lechima, people that are in the Israeli army, support. Okay, so David HaMelech said like this: everyone is going to get the spoils of war. Those who fought and those who did not fight. Now look at this weird pasuk. Vayime hayom ma'u v'mala, vayisimeh lechok u'mishpat liYisrael ad hayom hazeh. The Tanakh tells us that David HaMelech made a law from then on that the spoils of war are divided amongst all, which is very strange. Why? Because we just read that in Bamidbar that was already done in Chemet Midian. The Torah says to give it all to the Eidah. Sorry? Right, so what it sounds like he made it up. And in fact, Rashi, if you look in the bottom, next page, Rashi says, Lo ne'emar v'hala ela v'mala kfar hinig Avraham b'chok zeh. Rashi actually tells us that Avram, when he freed Lot, and they took the spoils of Sodom, and he did not want to take anything, but he did divide them amongst all. So Rashi says this was not a new thing.
It wasn't stolen, it was the command, it was the law.
I mean, the 4 against the 5. Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. The 4, not Lot. You're right. Well,
It was law, but it wasn't stolen.
Melech Sodom came out. Wasn't that?
It was MKC.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So there he divided all the spoils amongst everyone. Rashi points out, not just the soldiers. So what's going on here? What's the big chiddush? So some people say that you're right. It wasn't David HaMelech's big chiddush, and it was done before, but this law was forgotten and not really used. And David HaMelech, he really brought it back. Okay, I don't like that so much personally, because that's not a great answer, right? Like the Tanakh is just suggesting that David HaMelech did something that no one ever did before. But perhaps I actually wrote about this. It might be that David HaMelech actually did something quite interesting here that no one that he emphasized something that perhaps wasn't so clear before. In Sefer Bamidbar, if you look after Bamidbar, I brought you the Netziv of Volozhin, who basically almost repeats my question. On Sefer Bamidbar, the Netziv says, Af agav shelo nilchamu, ela shamru hakelim, harei hem ketofsei milchama. Even those who did not fight but guarded the camp, they are also considered to be fighters. Like David HaMelech said, Ki chelek hayotzer milchama uki chelek hayoshev al kelim. And he even quotes our pasuk that tells us that David HaMelech divided those who fought and those who did not fight. The Malbim has an interesting point, which I think that some people would find this very, very interesting nowadays. The Malbim says, and this brings me to my answer. The Malbim says, "V'chatzita," you divide the spoils. שאמרו חז"ל, יחצו לשני חלקים שווים. They divide equally. חלק אחד ייקחו תופסי המלחמה, וחלק השני ייקחו כל העדה. Now, כל העדה. Did David HaMelech say כל העדה? David HaMelech did not necessarily give it to the people, he gave it to the soldiers. In Sefer Bamidbar, it seems that when you bring back the spoils of war, you have to understand, yes, you're a fighter, yes, you're a soldier, but you represent the people. And therefore, it's not your spoils. The spoils go to the people. And by the way, if you look in Sefer Hot Melachim of the Rambam, and it's the last source I gave you on the sheet, the Rambam is very, very clear. Kol ha'ogei ha'melech, mamunam la'melech, ve'kol ha'mlachot. This is what's important. Kol ha'mlachot shekovesh, harei otzarot ha'melachim la'melech. The first part is when the king kills someone, then his his inheritance, right? Is the king inherits whoever, if the guy a murderer that the king puts him to death, so the mamlacha, the nation, the kingdom receives the inheritance. But all the countries that he conquers, the otzarot hamelachim, the treasures of all the kings, go to the king. Ushara biza shebozizim, all other spoils, notnim lefanav. He gets it. V'hu notel mechza barosh. He takes half to his treasures, and the rest of the half you divide. Kol anshe hatzava biyachad hima'am hayoshvim ala kelim. Notice what the Rambam says. Rambam says half goes to the people, and the other half goes to the army, to the people that fought. It could very well be that in Sefer Bamidbar, what's very clear is that it goes to the back of the people. What David HaMelech perhaps made, and that I think is a very important statement, David HaMelech made very clear that even the cook in the army is important. And even though he didn't fight, he is considered a fighter. To me, that's a chiddush of David HaMelech. Meaning the idea that we divide amongst everyone because it's not your personal, that we already have that idea. But it seems perhaps that David HaMelech divided amongst the soldiers themselves because there's always that kind of tension, even nowadays in the Israeli army, in every army. The guy who, sits in the back or is not in the tank or is not mamash in the front line, but he's dedicating all his life to the Israeli army, and without him there would be no army. The David HaMelech statement is a psychological one, right? Sorry, psychologit. that he's giving basically a message over to all the chayalim that we need everyone, and that the efforts that you gave for this war to happen, you get the same spoils that everyone else gave. And it's interesting because if you go back to the Malbim said that why did the people get it? Not because I suggested the people get it because it's not the chayalim. The Malbim suggests because even the people that did not fight have a piece of the victory. Why? Alidei tfilatam. Oh! So I know all of you are going to take this right away to like those who learn Torah all day and say we did it. Okay, so I knew. But putting that aside,
we're not supporting.
Putting that on the side, I do think that there's something that we can take from the Malbim. Even those of us that really do understand that obviously those who are fighting are the ones who deserve the most gratitude. But I do think that we can look from a different perspective and say that at times of war, the expectation is for everyone to do their bit. I think that there's always a feeling, everyone here, I'm sure, had different, feelings and emotions during the war. But I think we all shared this. What do I do? I remember feeling like an old man because I wasn't called up. At some point, much later, not long ago, I reached out to someone in the army and say, I heard that you might need tank people. He said, great. He said, what tank were you on? So I wrote to him. He says, sorry, no. We only need people that were Merkava. I was on an American patent on a Magach. He made me feel very, very old. But I mean that feeling of I told people I remember because I remember that I remember that I was told I was 1 year old. My parents told me they were living in Pardes Chana in the Yom Kippur War, and everyone was taken out from the shuls to go to battle. And I remember not the same at all level, but I remember in 2002. So I was called up to Chomat Magen and on Pesach, and then my kids were called up, right, on Simchat Torah. So it was like this kind of and I was like that old man that's staying behind, and I felt like such a, oh my God, like I should be called up. It was just a few years ago I would have been called up, and that feeling of what can you do. And I think that this Malbim actually is important, that everyone has to do what they can do for the effort of war. If you're in the army, it's the army. But even as a civilian, there's always what to do and be part of the Eidah, be part of the people that, and therefore the spoils go to everyone because everyone has some nigiyah, some connection to the victory. But let's not forget that most of the spoils go to the fighters, to the army, and not to the people. So to explain what I just said now again is, just to summarize that, it could very well be that the idea that the spoils go to the people, that already was a well-known idea. But the idea that the Jobnikim, the people the people that maybe did not fight, David HaMelech made it very clear that they are important and vital to the victory of the war. Therefore, that we don't differentiate between them and the fighters themselves. So to sum up what we learned today, we tried to argue that in the classic wars in biblical times, the spoils went to the victors, and that was the default. However, we did see that in certain wars, our leaders and the people themselves were not always very happy to take the spoils of war, and we suggested different reasons for this. And the answer to our question, is it okay or not to take spoils of war, is I would say is a very gray area. That the default would be yes. However, there is a lot of dangers and problems with taking spoils of war, and that perhaps we should separate and differentiate between different types of war. Any war that could be looked upon as if we take the spoils of war, it would suggest that that's why we did the war, and that would create a suggestion that we have a political or any kind of gains that are not tahor, that are not real. Then I would say we should be very, very careful not to take anything, in order to make it very clear that we're doing this for the right reasons and not chas v'shalom to get any gain. It could be that I would say that if the enemy attacks us, for example, then you take their spoils because they attacked us. It's very clear to everyone that we're not doing that to take away their spoils. But in other wars, perhaps you should be very careful to make that statement. That's what we learned from other cases. And lastly, we saw that there's a very strong idea in our tradition that it's not just the soldiers who take the spoils, but that fight, but rather the whole entire army, and perhaps anyone that participates in the victory on any level should also enjoy the spoils as a statement, more not about the spoils, but the statement that everyone has a Kosher to the victory of war. It doesn't take it's not just the Chayal, but the entire people, the entire nation, who are part of a victory in wartime. Oh, so with that, 10:15. Look at that. I finished the 4-week series. I think I won't see you till I assume till B'ezrat Hashem next year. So I wish you I'm off to in a few weeks. I'm going to camp in Camp Stone in America, and I hope to see you B'ezrat Hashem Elul or whatever it is next year. Have a good summer.
The best player.
Thank
Yeah, put it on yourself.
Monday. Yellow bird.
Yeah, okay, no, I'm going.
It's a regular. You don't support them. I have kids and married kids.